Hey guys, what is going on? This is Hunter Bick. I'd like to welcome you to DragTheBar.com, and this is going to be my inaugural video series called Emptying the Clip, Big Bluffs in No Limit Holdem. And each part is going to cover a specific type of large bluff, the first one being overbet bluffs. And we are going to start off with just a couple slides real quick to cover some basics, and then we're going to look at a bunch of hands. So I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so to get started, let's look at why we would want to overbet bluff. The primary reason is simply because we can get more folds than with a smaller bluff size. And we can restrict our opponent's calling range to a very, very small number of hands. You'd be surprised how often you can get people to fold their bluff catchers when they're faced with a huge overbet when they were planning on calling a pot-sized bet with it. Another point is that a lot of people don't think about overbet bluffing. People play a lot of tables and it doesn't occur to them. So when they see a big overbet, they tend to give it a lot of credit, often because they would only overbet with like the nuts. So it's something they just give a lot of credit to. Another reason is to balance your overbet value range, which is a really great thing to be able to do. So let's talk about who we want to use it against. Well, the first person I kind of already mentioned, regulars who multi-table. They're playing a lot of tables, and they generally are not going to stop and pay attention just to your situation and really think it through and really think about what your range is and could you have what you're representing. Very often you'll just catch someone off guard with an overbet, and they just won't think too much about it, and they'll fold. Another person, this is pretty obvious, just real nitty people who are just going to be very tight, and they'll just see the huge bet size and just fold unless they have the nuts or the second nuts. These aren't the type of people who are going to be trying to make a hero call. So obviously you can capture a lot of fold equity by overbetting against them. And the other, and just kind of in general, someone who never overbets, they generally just assume it's the nuts. So they just don't think about balancing their overbet range because they don't overbet. They overbet so rarely. So that's another good type of person to do it against. Okay, so let's talk about some of the best times to use the overbet bluff. I usually use it on the turn of the river, mostly because when you overbet the flop, the dollar value of your bet is just really not that big relative to the stack sizes, so it doesn't tend to work as well. Plus, people with draws, they still get caught up in implied odds, and they don't like to fold. And anyone who has like top pair, they will generally call you. It just doesn't work very well on people generally play the flop pretty well. The other thing is that people tend to give credit to bigger moves later in the hand because it looks like you may have slow played something or hit a hand. So I generally find that you get a lot more fold equity by using the overbet on the turn of the river. Another reason would be that competent players generally play the flop pretty well. They kind of have a good idea when to check raise bluff. They kind of have a good idea when to, play back at a C bet, that kind of thing. They know what to do with their big draws. They know how much equity they have. So it's a lot harder to really get someone to make a big mistake on the flop. And the other benefit is by the time you get to the turn of the river, you have seen your opponent make more decisions. So you can generally have the information you need as to what sort of hand range he has. And with that information, you will know whether or not you can pull off a successful overbet bluff. And just a quick note on sizing. I think it's important an overbet is simply defined as a bet that is bigger than the pot size. However, betting 10% more than the pot is essentially betting the pot. So I know this is kind of obvious stuff, but it's important to think about it. Like, for example, if you are shoving and your shove is going to be like a small overbet, then it's really not an overbet. So it's important to distinguish between like a small one and like a meaningful one. Like 1.5x, like that's a solid overbet. 2x is a very solid, strong looking overbet. So those are the sorts of things we want to deal with, and those are the types of sizes that tend to be the most successful. Okay, let's take a look at some hands. Okay, so to get started, we're going to look at a pretty simple but pretty common spot where an overbet often will accomplish what a pot bet cannot. So I open ace king suited under the gun. I get called by this guy, LS Gambler, in middle position. Flop's pretty connected. I think it hits both of our ranges decently. So I make my standard half pot c bet. I don't really expect to have this guy. I'm not. I don't know how often he's gonna fold if I bet 40 instead of 25. So I thought it was just important to bet something so I can double barrel him if need be. So I lead out for just half pot, and he calls. So now I'm thinking the turn is such a blank that I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to get him off of. I might get him off of a jack. I'm not sure. I didn't know this guy real well, so I didn't know if he would just call me with an 8 here. But the thing to keep in mind is that if he checks the turn back, I'm going to be able to put him on a pretty weak range, like second pair and worse, because I think king queen or king 10 or something like that would probably bet here, often to protect their hand or to guard against or to get value from draws or something like that. So he checks it back, which is a very positive sign. And the 4 is just a total brick. So every draw missed. And now the question is, if I overbet here, is he going to call me with a jack? And we already established that we don't think he has many queens in his range. I think that he might check back queen 9, queen 10 maybe, but any other queen or any 2 pair or anything like that, he's definitely betting the turn. He's definitely going to bet the turn with like 9-10, of course, or a set. So there's just not a whole lot of hands I'm worried about here. So if I check to him, I think he's just going to auto check back and then show down his 8-7 or his jack 9 and win this pot from me. And I think I can keep him from doing that. So but I don't think a pot bet will do it either. A pot bet might do it, but I think I get a lot more folds if I do pot and a half. So about 135. This isn't a huge overbet. We're going to see some bigger ones, but this is, about a pot and a half. So so if he folds here 60% of the time, I break even, which is pretty good. I definitely think he's going to fold that often. I think he's going to fold a lot more than that, actually. So, we can take all the good hands out of his range. So at this point, it's, how often is this guy going to call in this spot with, a second or third pair? And I just think that he's definitely going to fold those hands more than enough. So he does go ahead and fold. So pretty simple spot, but I think this is a situation where a lot of people don't really think about all of their options on the river, given that he showed such weakness on the turn. So I think this is a great spot to just kind of blast him out of this pot, just because he's just never going to call here often enough with whatever weak hand he has. So okay, so here's another one at 3-6. I've got 4-4 in the cutoff, 5-handed game, and under the gun opens. I just flat call. It's pretty standard, and he checks it, which is really interesting because who does not c-bet this board? After raising pre-flop, I think he's going to do that with all of his air. I think he's going to c-bet any draw, definitely a king. So when he checks, it's like he's either check giving up, which is going to happen occasionally, or he has like pocket tens, jack 10, queen jack, maybe something like that, and he's hoping that I'll check back and he can pot control this thing. So when I see that, I'm going to start betting and I think half pot is a really good. I actually like this bet size because it'll get rid of his air if he's check giving up. So I'll win the pot that way. Or he'll have, like, if he has jack 10, I'm basically starting my bluff, and I'm going to be able to get him off of this later in the hand. So he check calls, and a 3 rolls off. So let's see what happens. So he checks, and I check back, and I'm actually not thrilled with that check back. I think it's okay, but I don't think I have to worry about him having a flush ever, because I don't think he would check the flop with it. So I'm not crazy about this check back. I think I would rather just bet it. But, we all make mistakes. We all play multiple tables, so these things do happen. Maybe at the time, I'd seen him, I don't know, get tricky and check call, check raise, or something like that. Regardless, the other thing I thought was that he was never going to fold. The other possibility here is that I probably thought he was never going to fold like a high club, like 10, queen, or ace. So maybe I thought I didn't have much fold equity there, but I would still prefer a bet. But that's okay. So I didn't bet, and the river is a very innocuous 6, and he checks to me again. So at this point, I don't have the best hand. I mean, he's got something, right? So he doesn't have a flush. He doesn't have a boat, because there's no way he's going to check the turn and the river with anything like that. I don't even think you check any. We know he doesn't have a king. So we can take out any sort of like good hand whatsoever out of this guy's range. The problem we've created for ourselves here is that I check back the turn, so it's really hard for me to have anything big either. So I've now put myself in a spot where it's obvious to him I don't have a flush. I can't have a boat. So he also knows that I have something marginal because this guy's a regular and he hand reads, pretty decently. So, so the only real option I could come up with as to how to win this pot was to bet like 2x, because I can put him on something marginal, and I basically have to put in enough money to make him unwilling to make a really big call with a very marginal hand. So that's what I do. And, I'm not saying this is going to work 100% of the time, but I definitely felt that it was going to work against this guy plenty. So, and this was just kind of me figuring out how to get out of a tough situation I'd put myself in. I think that the hand's a little easier, and I can win this pot a little bit cheaper by barreling the flop, or barreling the turn. But since I didn't, I had to get creative here and just try to blast this guy out of here. But when I can pinpoint a guy's range to something specific and marginal, like this guy right here in this hand, I'm just not going to let him win the pot. I'm just going to figure out what I need to do to take it and make him fold it. Because people just have a very hard time calling Jack 10 here, facing an overbet like this. So that was my thought process on the river. All right, cool. And he does fold, so it worked out. All right, let's check out the next one. Okay, so here's another heads-up situation. And most of the hands in this video are 6-max, but I think overbet bluffing is just as important heads up, and you probably get a few more opportunities to do it heads up than 6-max. So I think it's really important to show hand examples from both, because the concept is fundamentally the same. But yeah, anyway, okay, so let's check this one out. So I'm playing this guy who is a 70-54. For those that may not be familiar with heads up, these are very loose stats, and they're the kind of stats that only the very best heads up players are going to make profitable. And this guy is not exactly in that category. So let's just leave it at that. So he raises. I make a, what are we playing? We're playing 2-4. So I make a call. This call is a little loose for me, although against a guy who I'm not too worried about my ability to outplay this guy post flop. So I just go ahead and make the call, with suited stuff like this. And plus we are 200x deep, so with those stacks, it's borderline standard. So the flop is super dry, and I decided to donk out at it just because it is so dry that there's really just not much this guy is going to be able to call me with. I mean, my thinking was he either has a king or he doesn't. He'll call me with like a pocket pair or a king. So, or maybe an ace. I mean, this guy was really loose, and his fold to c-bet was 34. So it was dry enough. I thought I could get enough folds, but at the same time, let's keep in mind how wide this guy's flop calling range really is. And this is the kind of guy who's going to check call with one overcard. So it leads me to believe he'll call here with like an ace, or he'll call here with like 7-8. I mean, fish heads up, you see that kind of thing. So he definitely have 3-4. Who knows? So all right, so his range is huge, so he does call. Turn is a 6, which Obviously, he's in his range. So the plan here, I was going to check fold if he bet actually, because you know I think he's going to bet a king. He's obviously going to bet a six, and he was an aggressive player. So he checks back though, and this is just another. We're seeing this situation. We're going to see a situation a lot in this video where they show me weakness, and I'm gonna pounce all over it and try to just do whatever I need to take the pot away. Because this guy has just totally defined his hand for us when he checks back there. He can't have a king, he can't have a six, or he would have bet them either one of them on the turn. So he's either giving up with an ace, or God knows what, or he has like pocket eights, pocket sevens, pocket jacks, something in between, something very marginal, or a two. He could have two, three. He could have ace two, something like that. So once he checks it back, he tells us what sort of range we're up against, and we're going to see this routinely. And this is such a fundamentally important concept. So once he checks that back, that's what I'm putting him on. And so now I'm not sure I can win with a pot bet. I think I have a good shot at it, but I know I can win with an overbet. I really don't think this guy's going to see this and think that I have a six, and that's going to be the extent of his thought process. So, so I'm betting twice the pot. So that means he has to fold 66% of the time, 2/3. And I absolutely think I'm going to accomplish that here. But it is important to note, especially heads up. You get a lot of people who will check back heads up, and you get people who check back in six max. And their whole idea is, I'm going to check back. I don't want to get check raised, and this way I can pick off some bluffs. And you see that a ton heads up. So this guy might be thinking he's going to pick off a bluff with his ace high. Well, they don't really think about what the hell they're going to do when they see an overbet. So then they see it, and they're like, oh my god, this is a huge problem. He must have the nuts. So that is essentially the goal here, is to completely take advantage of his thought process and make him fold his bluff catchers, which, obviously a hand like pocket nine is the bluff catcher at this point. So that's what I do, and it works out, fortunately. And we won a pot that, we didn't have a whole lot of business winning, given our hand strength. So we're going to see one more heads up hand, and the rest are going to be six max. So let's get to the next hand. Okay, so this is a 5-10 hand, heads up. Played against this guy, E. Doyler on Poker Stars. I've played him for probably 500 or 600 hands, and this hand is one of the later matches we've played. So there's definitely a little bit of history. He definitely sees me as aggressive. I have a little bit of respect for his game, not a ton. He does win a little bit heads up, and he does do okay at six max. Having said that, I think he has some fairly decent leaks, and he does some stuff that I probably wouldn't do. But all in all, he can definitely mix it up and be tricky. So he's not like, you can't autopilot this guy, but he does do some things well. So okay, so I open up Jack 7. The biggest thing he does not do well, by the way, is playing a 63 VPIP from the big blind. That's just very, very loose, and I would not recommend that. So I raise Jack 7, he calls, and he checks and calls his flop against my standard c-bet. So when I look at his range here, I mean, he could have any pair, he could have any ace, he could have a lot of draws, and he would play them all pretty much the same. He does not like folding to c-bets, as you can see from his full versus flop c-bet stat at 46%. So, the reason to c-bet this guy is, you pretty much, when you c-bet someone who doesn't like to fold to c-bets, you pretty much have to be ready to double barrel them or triple barrel them, depending on what falls. So you almost just have to keep firing sometimes once you c-bet. A lot of the times I will just not c-bet them, but anyway, so I decided to c-bet, and he checks this turn, and this is it's a decent card. It takes some queens out of his range. He's still going to check and call his draws and most pairs. So while if I decide to bet, I don't have a ton of fold equity right now, but it will give me a lot on the river, depending on what he does and what card shows up. So that's kind of why I bet here. I'm doing it definitely with the option of triple barreling. I'm keeping that in mind. And that's kind of why I didn't make it over 100, because I'm kind of basically I want to bet something, but I don't want to make the pot huge and have to make my river bet like enormous either. So I bet 85 into 140, and he calls again. Now at this point I can take a queen out of his range because he would have check raised it every single time on this turn. So he doesn't have a queen. So that's very positive. We can get that out of his range. So the 9 shows up. This is an interesting card because he could have king 10. He could have king jack. I mean, he definitely could have a flush at this point. The way he's played the hand, he does have some flush draws. I think he would have occasionally check raised like a huge flush draw, like the jack 10 of clubs. I mean, we can take a few flush combos out of there, maybe like jack 8 for the gut shot or something like that. But we can take a few of them out, not a ton though. But the biggest piece of information we get here is that he checks. Once he checks, like this guy is not going to check. He's not going to check raise me with a flush on this river. I think it's. In fact, he would bet out with a flush almost all the time, and he would also do the same thing with like jack 10. And I don't think he has jack 8, because I don't think he peels the turn with it. He would definitely peel the flop with jack 8, but probably not the turn. So at this point, we can take out. I think I can take out almost all of his flushes, just because he's going to lead out with them on this river. That's generally from what I've seen. That's my expectation of his play there. He might do something different with like a big flush, or excuse me, he might check and call like a really small flush, but I think he's going to lead out with anything better. So at this point, I've got him pretty much on a 10. I can take out almost everything else. So maybe a hand like pocket 8s, ace 10, something. He definitely has something that beats my jack high, but it's definitely not a monster. The problem is if I just pot it here, I expect him to look me up. The 9's a really good card for me to bluff, but I do expect him to look me up with a hand as maybe even jack 10. He's definitely not letting go of king 10 or ace 10. So, and I know I'm gonna have to bet bigger than like 200 anyway to even have a chance of folding those hands out. But I decide, even if I bet pot, I think he's still going to look me up occasionally just because he's seen me bluff him and he does not like to fold to me. So I think the only chance I have of winning this pot is with an overbet. So I decided to put out 400 because now when I do this, not only can I represent a queen, I can represent a straight, I can represent a flush, I can represent all kinds of stuff that beats his probably ace 10 or king 10, something like that. He has some sort of weak one pair hand. And I do have the added bonus of the 9's just a good card because not only can I take hands out of his range when he checks on it, but he can put a lot more value hands in mine. So I decided to overbet to make sure that basically to represent any sort of monster, and there are a lot of them on this board, and basically just maximize my fold equity and take this pot down. So, and he does fold, so it was definitely a good result. It's not a hand I think I could have won. I think I'd win it sometimes without an overbet, but I think the overbet is much more plus EV than just like 250 here. Okay, so this is kind of a quick hand at 3-6. In this hand, we actually end up overbet bluffing the turn instead of the river. I find most of the best overbet bluff spots come on the river, but you can find some really good ones on the turn, especially heads up. Probably a little more often heads up than in 6 max. But with that, let's check this hand out. So this guy, he's a 2116 PM Ilanov or whatever his name is, opens up. I just call here. This is a spot where I think this hand has a lot of equity against this guy's range, and he folds like 86% to 3-bet. So it's not the kind of I would just assume I'd almost rather play a pot against his range than just take it down pre-flop with a hand like this. But again, you can go either way. There's good reasons for both. So I check. This guy checks, and the pre-flop raiser checks back. So at that point, we know he doesn't have a jack. He probably doesn't have a flush draw, and he probably has something like ace high or maybe like pocket 7s, 8s, 9s, something like that. Maybe a 5. Something he kind of wants to. He's afraid of getting check raised. He wants to show down, or he could just be giving up completely on the pot. So here's so the deuce of clubs rolls off, and we definitely have some outs with our overcards and our queen high flush draw. But I thought this was a really good spot just to overbet. So I lead out for 90, just make it a solid, 1.5x. This allows me to represent just a lot of stuff, the flush, the jack. But more importantly, it is going to discourage these guys from peeling with like a club, like the king or the ace of clubs. When they see something like this, they can't be very excited about their implied odds because they're going to have to put so much in just to see the card that they're going to hit 20% of the time. So it discourages them from peeling, and the pre-flop raiser, if he does in fact have something marginal, this is probably going to get rid of it. Whereas, he either has something really marginal or he has air. So if he has air, he's going to fold anyway. So we might as well just knock out the marginal hands too. And that way we can just win the pot right here. And, no one has shown any interest in this whatsoever. But this is another spot where I just think that the overbet is just going to get a fold so much more often than even a pot bet. Like I think a pot bet's going to get called by a club, it's going to get called by a pair, whereas the overbet's just going to blow everything out of here, and we're just going to take this down even though there's two people in it. So that's what I did, and it worked out well. Okay, so here's another one. This one was actually at 1-2. I think I was making another video when this hand came up and thought it was pretty cool. So I end up in a blind battle. It gets folded around. I end up in a blind battle with this guy. He looks like a tag reg, pretty standard multi-tabler. So pretty easy to blind defense. I don't think I need to get into pre-flop. And so I flop my bottom pair with a backdoor flush draw. And he leads into me. And I think the call is super standard. I'm gonna have the best hand here occasionally. I also have some, nice outs with my trips, two pair, and backdoor flush draw. So pretty standard flop call, I thought. I am keeping in mind at this point that this board could get pretty ugly pretty fast, at which point I may decide to just start bluffing this too. So I think this texture is going to give my hand a lot of options on the turn in the river. So the turn is the jack of diamonds, and I've got my flush draw. And the board is definitely getting very connected. And he leads into me again, and I call. I don't think I turbo called in real life. I just clicked the button too fast. So he leads into me, I call, and obviously here I've picked up my outs. I'm not looking to fold. But I also think that there are, in addition to the fact that I'm picking up my flush outs, a lot of cards are going to be great for me to bluff at on the river as well, like an 8, a 10, a queen. There are going to be a lot of good bluff cards too. So again, even if I miss my flush, I'm definitely not too concerned about my ability to win this hand. So, I just think we're going to be able to move him off of whatever he's got pretty frequently. So let's talk about his range, I guess, a little bit. He could definitely have a king. I think a jack is probably in his range. I mean, some guys will value bet like queen jack, jack 10 here. Others won't. I think this guy probably will because most of these hands that have a jack also have a gut shot. I guess he could have ace jack, but again, I'm not super, even if he does, it's really not a big deal. In fact, it puts more hands in his range that we might be able to move him off of on the river. So let's look at the river card. And that's a 9. So, and what does he do? He checks. Okay, so now the question is, I think bluff. I don't think I'm good here nearly enough to check. I think I definitely need to bluff at this. So the question is like, what can we fold him off? Like the top of his range here when he checks is going to be like king queen, maybe even ace king. So he could have those. He could have, I think he's betting king jack every time. He could have king 10. He could have like queen jack. But these are all like pretty good one pair hands. But compared to this board, like they're not looking that great anymore. So with the 9 pairs, the 9 is absolutely in my range, considering that it was second pair on the flop. I mean, that's like a standard call. So, at worst here, I can represent trips. I can also represent 8-10 for a straight. I can represent queen 10, and the straights alone are like 32 combos worth of hands. So I can also represent a bear 9. I can represent a boat like 9-7. I can represent even king 9. I can represent a lot of huge hands on this board when I bet big. So I'm gonna bluff him, and the question is how much. So I think if I just pot it, this is another spot where I think if I pot it, he's gonna just call me with. He's definitely calling ace king. He's probably gonna call. He's gonna call with king queen. King 10 maybe. I don't know about like king 6 or any of that. I mean, I think I might get some folds there. But what is he gonna do when I bet 100 and he's got ace king and he's looking at this board? I mean, he's not gonna think that I'm gonna turn king queen into a bluff, and you know I can represent credibly probably 50 hand combos of just monster hands. So I think this is a really almost borderline standard place to overbet, just because I do think he has like a decent king often enough when he double barrels me. And then when he doesn't, he's going to fold to any bet anyway. So I might as well. It's another spot where I might as well just bet more and pick up the extra fold equity and get him to fold off his hands that are pretty much like ace king is close to the top of his range here. I mean that's a it's pretty solid. However, I think I can definitely move him off of it with on a board like this. So this is a great. This board just rolled out perfectly for me to do this, and he does end up folding. But when the board gets this scary and you can put them on something decent. Now, obviously, I think if he had bet this turn, think if he'd bet this river. When he checks it, I think he's either giving up on a bluff or he has some semblance of showdown value that he's hoping I'm going to check back. Either way, I can win the pot. It's just a matter of how much do I need to bet. So this one, the board texture was hands down the most important thing for me. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to leave me any feedback or ask me any questions in the forums, or you can send me a private message, either way. But look for part 2 coming out in the near future, and I'll talk to you guys soon.